the other half. Very happy to see this type of crowd. Me, an anthropologist here at Kio Design, and Erlend, former art critic, now curator and art historian, are invited to talk about, or to give a lecture that's entitled Towards a Design Criticism. And again, I need to state that this bold pitch for our talk that stated that art criticism is in need of new optics, and that is anthropology, needed to complement the established art historical and critical theory-informed approach. It is not entirely mine, although I share it. Now, the advantage of focusing on design as an entry to this is twofold. First, there is no real established design criticism, so it's perfectly legitimate to propose something new. And secondly, anthropology is already an integral part of the academic theory base for design research. So I would say the need for such an approach is very evident in much of the more agency-oriented, activist, socially oriented contemporary art, but also related to tackle decolonizing perspectives, producing relevant criticism in the Anthropocene, and even in the sort of ongoing debates, the critique of criticism. The point of departure to look into all of this, however, was an invitation by art historian and gallerist Maria Valle in 2015 on contributing to an anthology about blind spots in art criticism, design being one of those. And I was fortunate to be able to invite Erlend on writing about this. We've had a dialogue going for almost a decade, with a great deal of overlap in our perspectives, and it was about time something got out of that. Launched in this book last fall, part of New York Art Fair. Now, our title, Towards a Design Criticism, is not meant to solve the vast field of design's need for more critical discourse. On the contrary, hopefully it gives us a sort of free pass to treat the subject more instrumentally. Now, a recap about the design criticism seminar organized here at Kio back in 2014. Or rather, the lack of an existing design criticism was the thing. And little had apparently happened in the wake of the now famous design criticism competition in 2008, organized by the former Foundation for Design and Architecture and Kunstkritik, with the aim to stimulate the establishment of an even then largely non-existent design criticism. Now, the jury didn't find any of the 38 contributions worthy of any prize. Nevertheless, there were several other interesting initiatives about the same time, both here and internationally, particularly in the form of establishing independent journals, fashion theory being a very prolific field at the time, and also several educational programs in design criticism were set up, such as Decrits at School of Visual Arts, Design Writing and Criticism at London College of Communication, and Critical Writing in Art and Design at the Royal College of Art, both on an MA and a PhD level. Now, there were a certain indecisiveness, I must note, regarding whether these were to be offered as MFAs or MAs. Criticism considered as practice or theory. Hamid, once again. I got very interested in Hamid's writing around the same time, in that he was incorporating an almost embarrassing honesty, or reflexivity or transparency about the socio-cultural aspects at play in evaluating art. I myself have been manipulating symbolic value for a living as chief strategist for an international advertising company, following a dissertation challenging the notion of design history as authoritative. So, that's a long time ago, but nevertheless, the overlap in an approach or an interest in an approach that does not prioritize an aesthetic over a contextual interpretation, but includes both the work and the context around it, remains. And it's important to state that this is, of course, not anything new for artistic practice, for academic research, but it's still kind of rare to see it applied in criticism. Now, in design, or for design, it's perhaps more obvious that critics who would conduct pure expressive, pure art history, or for that matter, pure sociology, will immediately reveal a problematic lack of understanding of the objects and phenomena to which they relate. Design, what's design? It's a very vast field, but I would say a common denominator would be agency and affecting the world. And that rings true also for the more critical, discursive, or speculative design practices represented at this institution, kind of advocating design's potential beyond mere problem solving, in proposing new realities, not merely as comments, but as real propositions put out to circulate in the world. So rather than appropriating the established art criticism, successful initiatives attempt to develop a type of criticism or design that takes into account the complex place and effect of design in culture, in society. And I've asked my students at the design department to help out, proposing what design criticism can or should be. And the answer thus far, after 2 years of running a course in design criticism, is, I would say, progressive in content, but rather conservative in form. And while contemporary art criticism is sort of seeking out new and experimental paths, and criticism in many cases is seen as a subjective artistic practice, the most pressing need in the field of design, in contrast, is in fact to create a more, objective discourse in order to increase the seriousness in the conversation, a kind of old school criticism that communicates a depth, an influential force of an apparently superficial phenomena, blah, 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 but to try to sort of implement a by now obsolete stage in the fledgling field of design criticism is perhaps not the best way forward. So I'm curious as to how to solve this. Perhaps design criticism can skip a stage in such a presumed linear development process. I don't know, similar to technology races where fixed trajectories are skipped for wireless solutions kind of thing. At a time when the boundaries between art and design are unclear in an increasing number of cases, the fields bleeding into each other, crafts becomes trendy, design becomes conceptual, and use value is in fact said to re-emerge in fine art, challenging the sort of 200-year-long tradition of purposeful purposelessness. Making, the concept of use very central, or usership as promoted by art theorist Stephen Wright. And this has been, of course, reflected in many interesting initiatives in recent years. For example, the brilliant seminar Uses at the Royal Institute of Art in Stockholm, initiated by Marta Kusma in 2016. I would also like to mention the exhibition Making Use, Life in Post-Artistic Times at the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, all sort of focusing on art as a tool for change in some respect. Well, in such a hybrid landscape, where many of the most interesting works are sort of flickering in between different states or categories. I mean, one recent example could be Christopher Calendron Thomas and his work New Elam, as presented as part of our Design Talks Night series. His work was promoted as being, by us, as being at the intersection of design, contemporary art, architecture, activism, branding, speculative approaches, anthropology, and more. Nonetheless, an interdisciplinary apparatus is obviously imperative, both in theorizing and in criticizing that kind of work. I'll have like a quick crash course in anthropology. Anthropology is not ethnography, right? We all know about the ethnographic term in contemporary art, as formulated by Halfoster. Anthropology is not ethnography. Ethnography is merely a methodical step towards a kind of, I don't know, cross-cultural comparison and identification of patterns that otherwise might remain hidden to us. Anthropology is not a descriptive endeavor. It is at its core seeking out potential for cultural critique, of generating reflexivity and making it possible to identify other ways of making sense of this world, right? So very, very similar to a lot of artistic traditions. Art and anthropology has had a complex and somewhat troubled history. For one thing, over the notion of culture. The current mutual interest between the two, both in theory and practice, was also the point of departure for an issue I edited of the Norwegian art history journal Kunst og Kultur a few years back. And in the introduction, one of my favorite quotes found its place again. And it's by anthropologist Mary Douglas, who stated in 1996, "They, art historians, find us embarrassing, we the anthropologists. They suspect that our crude imputations of motive do violence to the aesthetic issues." I would say, well, yes and no. One influential advocate for this reapproachment of art and anthropology is art historian Grant Hester, claiming, in fact, it's one of the most promising directions for new research into contemporary art practice. And he's of importance in this context, primarily because of his journal for a so-called socially engaged art criticism, entitled Field. And the analysis behind this initiative is formulated as follows, and I'm nearly done. We are living through a singular cultural moment in which the conventional relationship between art and the social world and between artist and viewer is being questioned and renegotiated. The title of this journal, Field, reflects two main concerns. First, it indicates that our interest in a body of artistic production that engages the broadest possible range of social forces, actors, discursive systems, and physical conditions operating at a given time. And second, it signals a concern with the questions that these projects raise about the proper field of art itself as it engages with other disciplines and other modes of cultural production. How do these practices redefine our understanding of aesthetic experience? And how do they challenge preconceived notions of the work of art? For many in the mainstream art world, this opening out is evidence of a dangerous promiscuity, which threatens to subsume assume the unique identity of art, and as a result, this work has been largely ignored by the most visible journals and publications in the field. At the same time, an often problematic concept of social engagement has become increasingly fashionable among many institutions, and there is clearly a need for a more intelligent and nuanced analysis of the group tendencies, says Ralph Kester. This is not me. So, concluding, he says, it has become increasingly clear that the normative theoretical conventions and research methodologies governing contemporary art criticism are ill-equipped to address the questions raised by this work. Yeah, and the answer is easy and difficult. It's interdisciplinarity. Now, I'm out of time. I would just say that the potential for this sort of activist and socially engaged art, post-art, not about works, but about, I don't know, in Stephen Wright's words again, about sort of artistic competence or potential. But I'm also intrigued by the possible contributions for such an approach in dealing with this whole decolonizing wave, in tackling art in the Anthropocene, as I said, as well as the criticism or art criticism itself. But this remains to be explored, I think, in practice. And practice being your cue, Mr. Practice.
Yeah. I'm going to be, is this close now? Yeah. I'm kind of interested in all the things that Charlotte is interested in. But I'm primarily interested in criticism itself. I am originally trained as an art historian. I wrote about American art of the 1960s, and around the time when I first met Charlotte, I was embarking on a PhD project, which has now been left to die in the graveyard of unfinished PhD projects, that was supposed to deal with three topics. American land art of the 1960s, the Berlin techno club Berghain, and the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I don't remember how they fit together, and that's probably one of the reasons why it was never finished. But my interest and how it overlaps with what Charlotte has been talking about is because I've been interested in what kind of writing is art criticism. My starting point has been that art criticism is not a genre within journalism, and that it's too often mistaken to be a kind of journalism. Journalistic art criticism is a genre of art criticism, but it's not the literary genre of art criticism itself. The result of this position is that art critics should be free to choose and pick between different styles of writing, and that was what I was trying to do when I worked as an art critic, and a lot of other people did the same thing around the same time. My view on criticism is that it should be inspired by and result in a kind of experience-based form of writing. And that means that you should be able to include details that are not necessarily regarded as relevant. And there are many other examples of this, some more famous than others, but for example, the art forum website Gossip Diary Seen and Heard, I think at that time, around 2005, 2006, was a very necessary form of art writing, which was influential for a time, and I think now has gone back to being sort of forgotten. And the goal of all of this was to establish a kind of critical position that did not adhere to the conventional view of the critic as a figure of authority. It was a kind of attempt at breaking down the authority of the critic, something which also doesn't mean that the critic should simply be some kind of chatty, fluffy, friendly character. on the contrary, that view of a critic, I think, makes it more possible to write also extremely scathing reviews, because if you establish the figure of the critic as someone who doesn't really have any kind of privileged position to make those statements, then that means that it becomes a broader conversation where artworks, artists, curated shows, all different elements of the art world are simply different kinds of contributions to the same conversation. It's also important to note, I think, that too much criticism is written solely relating art to other art, or relating art to some kind of idea about what art is or what's important about art. Typically that leads to people basically just writing the same text 100 times. If the only thing you're interested in when it comes to art is the possibility of it offering new perspectives and changing your view of the world, then all the texts a critic like that would write is simply to state this art opens up new perspectives on the world, or it doesn't. It becomes basically the same text over and over again. That also means, I think, that criticism doesn't really have an obligation to the art about which it's written. Journalistic art criticism might have some kind of obligation like that, in the same way that it might also have some kind of obligation to the reader. Of course, if you think about other kinds of reviews, like movie reviews or theater reviews in a more commercial sense, it has consequences for how many people come to see the movie, or how many people come to see a show in a theater, or in a totally different field, how many people come to a brand new restaurant. I don't think art criticism, at least in the last 30 or 40 years, has ever brought more people to see an exhibition. I don't think that dynamic is relevant at all. I think it has absolutely no effect, which is very liberating. And it also means that people shouldn't take art reviews so seriously or so profoundly if you happen to get a bad review. Which I know from having curated shows that I've gotten bad reviews is of course difficult, but you still have to kind of be able to live with it. And this, I think, to make it somewhat relevant to the setting of where we are right now, is that the language surrounding so-called artistic research is also in some way potentially affected by this new view of a kind of experience-based criticism, where you also draw in different disciplines like anthropology. Because the language that surrounds artistic research is very much related to a whole different form of language, which is that of the new public management. Like the way institutions have changed over the last 30, 40 years, and how the values of new public management, does everyone know what new public management is? Very, very shortly summarized, it's a kind of malls, like new ways of measuring and providing funding for public projects based on a new kind of measurability, that you should be able to see results, and then you have to put institutional systems in motion to be able to measure something. One of the examples of which is the idea of having an art academy be accepted as a scientific institution. That's a very typical, clear example of something that's been developed because of the needs of public punishment. At the same time, the art institutional defense for artistic research is that it represents a very developed and advanced form of discourse. It's not simply a matter of aesthetics. It's a much more complete and potentially experimental discourse. And the result sometimes or often has been to draw artistic practice more closely towards academic research, which means that it becomes even more specialized and in that sense less open to an imagined wider public, because much like let's say high-end academic research is not necessarily very approachable for an average person who's simply interested in mathematics. It becomes the same kind of specialized system within the art world and specifically within art education. And this, I think, can be very useful to include anthropological elements to the conversation, because it offers the opportunity to give a more kind of holistic approach to everything. Design demands that you consider a lot of different cultural elements that you typically don't talk about when you talk about art, which can be equally relevant. When you have someone like or like a fashion house like Balenciaga, for example, who very, very clearly relates to contemporary trends and discourse in visual culture on the broader whole, then it's impossible to discuss the latest show by Balenciaga without taking all of those names into consideration. And if you go to see an exhibition by Bjarne Melgaard or someone who's also extremely interested in culture as a whole, then it becomes very limiting to discuss the paintings of Bjarne Melgaard simply in relation to paintings. So this whole way of introducing kind of arbitrary elements in the conversation, I think gives the writer an opportunity to open up the field, which is also obviously beneficial to the field of art itself. And I think to finish up, this will be especially even more and more true the more and more specialized and difficult the art that's produced, or the discourse, the knowledge that's produced in the Art Academy. The more difficult the projects that are in place as PhD projects or educational systems, the less available it becomes to the wider public, the more important it will be to draw on the entire cultural conversation where anthropology can be a very useful tool. So I think I'm going to end there, and that's exactly on time. But I don't know if is there time for questions? What's the plan?
Okay, well, Tommy. Yeah, you can take questions, no problem. Okay, yep.
Are there any questions?
Sorry, I would just also just make a quick comment to the context for this lecture and also the next. I think it's very see again of this institution to start off the Artistic Research Week by inviting theorists conducting artistic research. I mean, that is a Stardust hybrid that very rarely finds its sort of evaluating mechanism. What you're conducting is not merely research, you're not an artist, and this is a kind of hybridity that criticism and curation, for that matter, also suffers from in this sort of educational system. So I really appreciate that, actually, that there is a place in artistic research for theorists. It's also very welcome to email questions or comments later on if people need time to sort of.
It's very interesting. I mean, how do you, why anthropology, why not sociology or psychology? Or I'm just asking because anthropology, of course, being now very wide in many different subgenres, there are some, as where methodology at the heart of anthropology is quite strong, quite specific. So, you know, why did you choose that?
Good question. I've thought about that lately, and my best answer is probably that anthropology as art is the only arena in which you can work with anything, and all of your practice is always, you know, it's always art, it's always artistic practice, or it's always anthropology. Like your whole existence becomes a kind of field work, as it were. It's sort of allowed to incorporate any other discipline in order to get where you want. Like art, I would say. So encompasses all of those others.
Anthropology is very interested in using some kind of otherness to help us to see ourselves.
Yeah.
Traditionally.
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah.
And I mean, is that something that attracts people rather than psychology or sociology?
Right. And that's also, I would say, the main friction point between at least contemporary art and anthropology, this whole notion of culture or otherness. Now I think, you know, people are, you know, including indigenous art, but in, you know, the good company of the Western art institution. Like, how decolonizing is that? It's not like, you know, it's like you're sort of afraid of pointing out any cultural difference at all. Hence, I also think anthropology could be interesting in that field. Thank you. That's very interesting comment.
I want to ask, again, thinking about cultural difference, about you talking about design, but most of what you said now, I know you gave an example of sailing and something like that, but you talked about art. So do you think art and design are the same things? Are they different? Do they have cultural differences? Sorry, like you said. And how does design criticism differ, or does it need to differ from art criticism?
In my opinion, I mean, the relationship between those disciplines are under constant negotiations, at least at this institution. And I think we all sort of relate to art as an overarching aspect, and then we do design practice as part of an artistic practice in a way here. So it's I think I again need to make it clear that we didn't set out to sort of solve this for the design field at all, but rather using it instrumentally in order to talk about this sort of blurry landscape, perhaps, projects that are not so easily classified.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously it's the beginning of a conversation, but a lot of that conversation also is, sorry, I feel as if I'm at the beginning of that myself, and it's partly about verbalizing, but a lot of it is also recognizing some, and I'm not trying to sound like a mystic person, but it's a lot of, obviously in both art and design, a lot of thinking is non-verbal. So again, so how do we work with that? And then I personally think I'm feeling that maybe working with criticism has some, again, this sort of thinking about the cultural, if you like, one particular, design isn't one massive thing. There are specific practices and they have their own languages, and in that sense, the anthropological approach and this idea of the other idea seems to me incredibly important. I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk anymore because
but I think it's a good, I mean, my initial response would be to at least your question of like the difference between art criticism and design criticism. I think my initial response would be that I think, like in my view, criticism is criticism, no matter what it relates to. So the ideals of how to write good criticism would be more or less the same if you're a restaurant critic, fashion critic, art critic, or music critic. I think the ideals of criticism as an interesting literary genre, I think, would be the same. And of course, there are huge overlaps between the art world and the design world, and occasionally, like the food world. So, I mean, these things, it's more a form of everything is a momentarily a subsection of cultural criticism on whole. But when it comes to there's one element of design criticism and art criticism which would always be the same, is that you have to verbalize a visual experience, at least in part visual. And the tradition for like phrases like putting into words the visual experience is it's of course like a massive foundation for these forms of criticism, but it's also one of the most annoying parts of it, both as a writer and as a reader. Like to read pure visual description is very, very interesting, and as a result, people almost don't do it. But then you remove the experience from the visual altogether, and then you're screwed in another way. So it's a very tricky field.